This lecture, and also some other, perhaps one or two future lectures, shall be inquiring into the question of the existence of God. It might be asked, for example, that why should we ask such a question? Especially that there are some systems of philosophy nowadays which simply do not acknowledge the possibility of giving any rational, solid answer to the question. However, the question is important and probably one of the most important questions we can ask in this life, simply because man is a searcher for meaning. And the question whether life has any meaning or not very much and very deeply depends on answering the problem of the existence of God. Is man alone on this globe? Are we the final, so to speak, products of evolution? Or is it true that there exists some other, some transcendent reality which for very many centuries all over mankind has been considered as divine? If the question of the meaning of life is essential and important, and it is because man by nature is a searcher for meaning, then the problem of God's existence is central in human knowledge, central to human life, and central to the philosophical inquisitions. Therefore, in answer to the question whether God exists or not, has to have some answer, some reasonable, hopefully reasonable answer. Why again? Because man cannot function on his or her full level of potentialities unless she or he lives some meaning as exercised in existence here and now. Now, this meaning may vary very much depending on the intellectual level of the person, the level of education, the psychological makeup of the person, and sometimes the very circumstances in which a person is born and develops his or her existence. Meaning, therefore, depends very much on the problem of whether God exists or not. We are using the word God here simply as a beginning, as a term to posit the question. We are at this point, I do not defend or describe or define the word God. It is only to clarify the position of the question. We can accept that God is what most people throughout the history of known history of man had been considering as some transcendent reality on which human life, human destiny, in some way depends very much. The very fact of man's limited condition also points to the urgency of the problem. Man is finite, in all directions, from all aspects of existence. Man is temporal, exists for a while, short time. Man is subject to all kinds of limitations of time, shortness of his life, his aging, and destined inevitably to die. This fact of man's mortality, man's dependence on his or her complete limitations of life, urges the necessity, the importance of discovering whether God exists or not in our lives. Why? Because answering the question, whether we answer it negatively or positively, does influence very deeply human existence. And therefore, we realize that the search for the answer in this area is probably one of the most important adventures, important efforts a man can have. Probably the most important question of all other possible questions. The implications of either answer are very, very deep and very essential. If God exists, then there is the possibility for man to communicate perhaps with the divine. If God exists and somehow addressed mankind in some way or other, and we know that there are religions in which claim that God did de facto address humanity. Human life, therefore, in such case, has completely, radically, definitely some relatedness to the divine. Of course, the question whether God addressed mankind shall also be discovered in detail somewhat later. But at this point, our problem is to realize how essential and how important the question really is. Does God exist? Or are we alone on this globe? If God exists, then once again, the possibility of religious union, of religious values, of religious direction in life are possible. And human destiny may be radically different than in case when any other answer to the question is given. If, on the other hand, God does not exist, then again, many things, practical things, essential things in life, will be different. Problems of, let's say, even morality, for example, will be deeply affected by negation of God. For an atheist, all that exists is the years of life between the womb and the tomb. Here and now. I am born, I live, I develop, I do something. I build something, I believe in something. I fulfill somehow myself, temporarily, of course. I age and I disappear into nothingness. Disappearance, death, here, means complete annihilation. There is nothingness, zero existence left for someone, for mankind, for human beings, if God does not exist. Because then we will have to accept simply that all reality is nothing else but some chaotic, purposeless movement of different forms of matter, with different shapes, different constellations, evolutionary developing, expanding and impending, and ultimately also leading to extinction and some sort of thermal death. The so-called second law of thermodynamics, or entropy. In this context, the search for meaning receives a very low answer, so to speak. What is the meaning of life if there is no God? Well, there simply is no durable, perfect destiny for humans. Men are accidental, ephemeral constellations of material laws, matter, convolutions of matter, for a time blindly developing because there is no purpose in the cosmos. And my life is only a chaotic, momentary, in a manner of speaking, appearance and disappearance. To say it briefly, nihilism. Naturally, an unbeliever, an atheist, will also develop artificially for himself some sort of meanings. There will be man-made meanings. All kinds of different realities which will absorb his time here from birth to death. Those meanings, however, and this is important to remember, are temporal only and man-made. Since the cosmos is chaotic, without purpose, there is no creator, there is no intelligence planning the universe in any way. Everything is blind chance, nothing else, including naturally man's birth, his life, and his existence. And finally, disappearance. Death is absolute and final. For an atheist, therefore, there is no other way of looking at reality. The answer, the final answer for an atheist is simply skeptical, atheistic attitude and radical denial of any sort of transcendent reality, of any sort of transcendent divinity. Before, however, we go into more detailed analysis of the problem, we have to have some content, some meaning, some understanding of what the word God at this stage of our discussion may mean. Is God a who? Or perhaps a what? The notion of God remains to a great extent mysterious. And on a pre-philosophical level, people do believe, some do, some don't, but many do believe in God. But the concept, the notion of God, is used in a very imprecise way. Religions, of course, maintain the ideas, the religious concepts and the religious convictions in humanity. But God remains finally a mystery, some sort of infinitely transcendent, personal, living reality. A God who is interested or not interested in what happens in this world. If somebody accepts the deistic attitude, deism means that God did create the universe, but he let it go. Once he created this universe, he let it go. Some echo of Aristotelian concept of God is present here. But he doesn't bother with the petty, small affairs of humanity, of man. Then we have the other solution, that God simply is identified with this world, with the universe. Pantheism. Pantheism means all is God. And when all is God, then naturally the religious concept of God somehow is empty, because all people by religion understand that God is not this universe, but is the cause, the beginning, the source, the absolute infinite reality on which the very existence of the cosmos depends, including man. Pantheism, therefore, is in a way a sort of atheism. And then, of course, we have theism, the belief in one God. Theists, we have at least in existence 3 monotheistic religions, which we can call deists or theists, theistic religions. Judaism, the Muslim religion, or Mohammedanism, and Christianity. The concept of Brahma in Hindu religion is very difficult here to put together with monotheism, because it has some aspects of pantheistic understanding, pantheistic attributes. Buddhism is sometimes in books of religions of the world, history of religions, Buddhism is mentioned also as a religion. But on somewhat deeper understanding of the teaching of Sakyamuni, Siddhartha, or the Buddha, we know that Buddha never encouraged any philosophical inquiries, metaphysical questions, like, for example, does God exist, and so on. He discouraged such discussions. Therefore, Buddhism could be probably better defined as a philosophy of life, as a way of living. And we know that the basic premise of Buddha's teaching is that life is suffering, essentially suffering, and this suffering is created by man himself, his aspirations, his desires, his illusions, which create despair and a sort of miserable existence here in this world. Therefore, a true Buddhist is longing for nirvana. Nirvana primarily being defined as a sort of complete peacefulness, absolute freedom from any sort of the suffering in this world. It is doubtful whether Buddha even acknowledged that human beings have a self. So from this viewpoint, from this advantage of such considerations, Buddhism really is not a religion. But the consequences of human attitudes to the problem will be defined more precisely and with more detail later on in our philosophical analysis of the question of the existence of God. Naturally, we have all kinds of people in this world. We have atheists and theists, skeptics and pantheists. We have deists and so on. And we also have different religious persons. Religion is by no means extinct in any way. But in our so-called modern or postmodern times, the question becomes very, very much acute, becomes, so to speak, a very, if I may use the word, hot question. So, our question, the second point now will be, which method should we apply in our inquisition? How to approach the question even? Of course, there are many, many philosophical systems fighting each other and not necessarily conducive even to posit the problem. For a skeptic like David Hume, for example, the very question of existence of God seems to be not really in place. We also know that other systems deny the very possibility of knowing, of ascending to the knowledge of God. So we must say at this point that although there are different answers to our question of knowledge, which is central here, none of the skeptical, nominalistic, Kantian, pragmatist or positivistic or dialectical existential answers really can be seriously treated and seriously discussed, because many of those systems, although very great and developed, perhaps even products of genius in thinking, nevertheless, they deny the possibility of the human mind's ability to transcend the visible, tangible sense data, to reach beyond into the non-visible reality of the infinite absolute. And therefore, they cannot be really taken in at the very beginning as possible candidates to answer the question. There are some of them which are self-destructive. They deny the natural dynamism of the human mind toward the transcendent. The concept of mind is quite often truncated. The mind is encapsulated by such philosophies into the here and the now, subject to sense data and only moving within this so delineated, encapsulated area. Such systems, of course, are not proper systems to discuss seriously the problem of God. The question of how much can man know is here very essential. And most of just mentioned systems deny, as we said already, the ability of the human mind to reach the absolute, the infinite. Anyone, therefore, who seriously wants to discuss, to analyze, to face the problem of God's existence, and to analyze the philosophical proofs of God's existence, must start with some basic preconditions, basic assumptions, which are necessary foundation of the whole journey of the mind from the finite towards the infinite. The first, it must be accepted, number one, that the mind, human mind, is not somehow evolved from sense data, some sense perception, but the mind is radically, by nature, absolutely different from sense perceptions, from knowledge gained by senses alone. The mind needs the senses as the occasion and beginning of knowledge, but the mind by itself is the radically different power. It has its own different nature, and therefore has its own different possibilities to know reality which is beyond the immediate sense datum. Next, we also must realize, this is point 2, that beings are not of the same nature, and that the concept of being admits, this is important, admits the so-called analogy of being, especially developed by Thomas Aquinas. Because of this analogy of being, the human mind can start with things which are perceived, seen, and touched, but nevertheless can reach as knowable by the human intellect towards the infinite through ideas which are grasped immediately, not immediately, that is, but rather because certain of our ideas as the objects pass beyond experience of sense data here and now, and they reach things which are invisible by discovery of some united relationship of what is invisible to what is visible and tangible here and now. The relation of likeness, of things unseen to visible things. That is the essential nature of analogy. Number 3, we must realize the radical finiteness of being, which is subject to human knowledge, but also the possibility that the laws of being have a broad extension as being itself. The concept or the notion of being is valid over the whole realm of being. And principle next, for principle of causality holds for the whole extent of reality here and now, and also transcendentally. In any degree, contingency, mutability is there when it comes to finite beings. But finite beings by no means are independent in any strict sense of the word. Every being, finite being that is, has a cause. And whatever exists and is finite is caused somehow. So, we are not only moving mentally within the context of phenomena, as Kant would have it, in so-called synthetic a priori judgments, but we realize and discover the transcendent on the basis of the world of direct experience. Causality is natural and not very questionable to understand. So, all these things, all those conditions, so to speak, must be accepted. And of course, the problems or the principles of non-contradiction, the principle that of nothingness absolutely not productive of any being, which means that being can only come because by another being. Nothingness can never in any way help us to understand what's going on. And also the principle of sufficient reason. When the dynamic inquiry of the human mind is satisfied when it comes to the intelligibility of the object of its inquisitions. Only when we accept those conditions within on which the human mind operates, on which the knowledge, true philosophical knowledge, is founded, can we really talk about serious, true, and valid philosophy. Therefore, before we go into the arguments for God's existence and also analyze the objections, we must define a little more, with a little more depth, the nature of philosophical knowledge and also the nature of so-called scientific knowledge. Philosophical knowledge deals with the deepest fundamental questions by its very nature. Philosophy is embracing being as such. Whatever falls under the notion of being is a first object of human philosophical reflection, also pre-philosophical even. The first realization of the human mind is that something is. Something is. Something exists. It is being. And under this concept, under this notion of being, all reality becomes an area of investigation for the human mind, in a deepest sense of the word, founded on already mentioned basic principles of intelligibility. Why is there a universe? Did the universe have a beginning, or is it eternal? Does God exist or not? What is man? Is man only matter, evolutionary development, destined to appear for a while and disappear into nothingness? Those are philosophical questions. From the viewpoint of scientific knowledge, A scientist does not need to answer such problems which I just mentioned. His basic specific field of inquiry is defined by the specific object of some part of reality. For example, biology deals with the nature of living things in the broadest sense. Here the questions of the nature of life, the question of evolution are under investigation within the context of the tools the scientist has. For a scientist, there must be always some sort of scientifically verifiable, based on sense experience finally, conclusion. As a human being, however, a scientist will face the same problems like anybody else. Outside of his scientific field, he may ask the question, what happens when I die? Is there any sort of afterlife? And so on. Questions which come natural, at least sometime in human life, to everybody. However, as a scientist alone, only as a scientist, he, as a scientist, does not need to inquire into the fundamental philosophical questions. A physicist is essentially concerned about the laws of movement, change, and matter. Anthropologist is trying to decipher the development of different forms of human life, quite often historically dependent on discoveries, excavations, and so on. An astronomer, with the great telescopes available now to scientists, discovers and is interested in the formation of galaxies, the expanding universe, the so-called black holes, and so on. But a philosopher always can stand and close to those people and say, all right, now what is the scientist doing here? A philosopher will evaluate the kind of knowledge available to science and the value of this knowledge. We know very well that scientific theories, well-founded though they are, change. The imagination about the globe, the center of the earth, and so on, is today gone. Other scientific concepts also are accepted for some period of time until new discoveries force the scientists to change the theory or perhaps to discard it completely. We know very well what revolution was caused in our outlook at the universe by Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity. Our concept of matter, to a great extent, is changed. So is the concept of time and also the concept of space. But it still is scientific theory and no more. In science, we have theories which give us real insights at the time being. But no scientific theory is, so to speak, absolute, eternal, forever. This domain, this area of the absolute, the eternal, the unchangeable, the transcendent, is the field of philosophy, and always was. Because as we said, or as it was said before, man is a searcher for meaning. Therefore, no matter how much scientific knowledge he will have, and how ingenious those scientific theories may be, the philosophical problems will still be very much alive for every thinking, mature, individual person. So, to the question, is science hostile to philosophical knowledge? In other words, is the knowledge produced by scientists somehow against philosophical knowledge, philosophical inquisitions? The answer is by no means, as long as we realize and know what science is and what philosophy is. Both are forms of knowing, but not exactly same, although they complement each other. The human mind begins with sense data, with perceptions, with this what is tangible and visible like any scientist. But the dynamism of the human mind goes far beyond what is given in sense experience. Philosophy and science is compatible. We can ask parenthetically, for example, when does a scientist become a philosopher? Well, when he faces the fundamental questions which we already mentioned in this lecture. Why does he face such questions? The answer is simple, because he's a human being. And for a human being, going back to what already was stated, the meaning of his whole existence is central. Man is by nature a searcher for ultimate meaning. And naturally, and of course, every scientist is a human being. So, after this sort of a general introduction to the problem, we will have to consider the basic arguments for the existence of God, and also to discuss the objections, the most significant objections to the believer's acceptance of God's existence. The arguments for God's existence stem from three sources: primordial or pre-philosophical. It is based on knowledge and the most obvious conclusions of common sense, which leads most people to acceptance of some transcendent creative being. Whenever something new appears within the context of human inquisition, the mind immediately asks, why? When I see a tree in the garden, I may say, well, I have sense impressions, I perceive it, I can touch it, I see it, I can hit it, I can feel it, and so on. But then fundamentally I ask, why is there a tree in the garden? And the same questions, the why, ultimately asking for the reason for existence of each being and the cosmos as such, this is where philosophy begins. But the pre-philosophical analysis is there, it is fundamental, but it is not precise enough. Nevertheless, it is, for many, many people, a pointer towards some transcendent creative divinity. And as such, it can be the fundamental foundation for their religious convictions. Knowledge, of course, must be presupposed from the very beginning, as we just mentioned today, in the conditions of intelligibility enumerated sometime before. This is one area, one way, so to speak, of affirmation of God's existence. Then we have the strictly philosophical arguments, which we will discuss in detail. And thirdly, the scientific corroboration, especially in the light of modern scientific discoveries. So, in order to validly approach the question, in order to come to some reasonable conclusion, we have to move through those three stages. Scientific knowledge can only present a corroboration. It can, so to speak, confirm the philosophical knowledge. But philosophical knowledge is not radically dependent on scientific corroboration. It stands on its own, on the dynamic, natural expansion of the human mind, which is radically and essentially different from sense data, although the knowledge of the mind, discoveries of the mind, start with concrete sense experiences. Among the arguments presented in various sources, different philosophies, we shall focus on only some, of course, because the time and the place does not permit anything more. By definition, we must be selective here. It is well known to most people are the so-called 5 ways of proving God's existence by St. Thomas Aquinas. In our times, modern Thomism is, of course, very powerful trend in modern philosophical reflection, especially in the West. So, the first argument which we shall develop is the so-called cosmological argument. Second will be teleological argument. And finally,